Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the SAIEE 71st Bernard Price Memorial Lecture on Provably Beneficial Artificial Intelligence. Before we start, a few webinar considerations. Attendees are reminded to ensure the volume is turned up on their device. Ensure you have a stable internet connection. This will ensure the streaming and audio will run smoothly. Attendees can ask questions via the questions panel located within the GoToWebinar control panel. By default, the control panel is located on the right-hand side of your screen. The chat function is reserved for webinar organizers and panelists to communicate with attendees. Attendees will not be able to chat with each other, however, are encouraged to ask questions. A recording of this lecture will be made available on the SAIEE YouTube channel. You will find the link to register in the chat box. Please click on that and register. It is free. A certificate of attendance will be issued a few weeks after this webinar, once we have received the CPD validation from EXA. I'd like to introduce you now to our host for this evening, Professor Yandel. He is the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Systems and Operation at the University of the Witwatersrand. He is a personal professor in the School of Electrical and Information Engineering at the university. He is also an NRF-rated scientist, a professional engineer, and an executive committee member of the South African Academy of Engineering. He is also a fellow of the SAIEE. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much. Good evening, good morning, good day, wherever you are. Welcome to this joint meeting of the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers and the University of the Witwatersrand, the 71st Bernard Price Memorial Lecture, Provably Beneficial Artificial Intelligence, which will be delivered by Professor Stuart Russell, but you'll hear more of that later. I recognize the President of the SAIEE, Mr. Prince Moyo, members of the Price family, past presidents, office bearers and council members of the Institute, colleagues and friends from all over the country, including the various centers of the SAIEE, and in fact, colleagues and friends from all over the world. My name, as you heard, is Yandel. I'm a DVC at the University of the Witwatersrand, or WITS, but I'm also a proud member of the SAIEE. I also bring you greetings from our Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Zeblon Vilakazi, who cannot be with us at this time. These lectures are named in honor of the late Dr. Bernard Price because of his outstanding contribution as an engineer to the power supply industry in South Africa, as president of the Institute, and as the founder of the Bernard Price Institutes of Geophysical Research and Paleontology here at WITS. This is the 71st Bernard Price Memorial Lecture, jointly hosted by the SAIEE and WITS, the first having been held in 1951. At that time, the SAIEE was 42 years old and WITS was 29 years old. Joint meetings between the SAIEE and WITS had in fact been held since 1931. You can't see this, but I'm wearing my SAIEE centenary cufflinks this evening, both to commemorate the Institute centenary back in 2009, but also to point out that this year, 2022, is the centenary year of WITS University. And if you look behind me, you will see the SAIEE books, Sparkling Achievements and More Sparkling Achievements, both with photographs of lightning activity on their covers. How appropriate, as it was Sir Basil Shonland, the Carnegie Professor of Geophysics at WITS and a lightning expert, who gave the very first Bernard Price Memorial Lecture. So WITS is 100 years old this year, by all accounts a young university. So to the President, Mr. Prince Moyo, your office bearers and council members, and all your members and friends, it is indeed a special event this year to be able to host the Bernard Price Memorial Lecture in the year of the university's centenary celebrations. Now, teaching and learning at WITS started in 1922 in response to a need from industry and the city. Today, we think of WITS's response to the coronavirus pandemic, a response that can be felt at the local and global levels through innovative research, including vaccine development, blended teaching and learning programs, community initiatives, and social activism. Today, we are confronted with a myriad of complex planetary problems, including global change and inequality, erratic energy supply and crime, lack of governance and ethics, the interaction of communicable and non-communicable diseases, pandemics, and so on. It is incumbent on universities like this one to bring the best intellectual talent and resources to bear across disciplines, institutions, sectors, and geographic boundaries to find solutions to these challenges. And the concept of working, as we do in this event, collaboratively with partners in industry cannot be emphasized enough for the value that it adds. We can continue to make a positive impact on society from our locale here in the global south if we remain true to our values. Search for and stand up for the truth, hold those in power to account, act with integrity, entrench proper governance systems, guard our academic freedom and institutional autonomy, tolerate differences of opinion, and stand up for democracy, justice, equality, and freedom. WITS remains a beacon of hope in our society, a national treasure that has developed with the City of Johannesburg and our industry as represented here by the SAIEE. Both the SAIEE and WITS will continue to impact on society for good for the next 100 years and beyond. Enjoy the lecture, and thank you for allowing the university the honor of being a part of this joint event. Now, friends, please do note that on your webinar link, you will see a handout tab. You will see 3 items included in there. If you click on that tab, you will find a copy of the 71st Bernard Price Memorial Lecture booklet, a copy of the SAIEE Training Academy brochure, and a copy of the September edition of the What Now magazine. So please do make use of those resources. Returning to the program, it now gives me very great pleasure indeed to introduce the president of the SAIEE, Mr. Prince Moyo. Prince Moyo is the General Manager, Asset Management at Eskom Transmission, which is the new national transmission company. He has been with Eskom since 1997, the same year that he joined the SAIEE. Prince Moyo was with the distribution business in KwaZulu-Natal from 1998 to 2010 and has occupied various roles within Eskom, including Engineer Technology Development, Middle Manager Network Services, Regional Engineering Manager, and General Manager Engineering. Mr. Prince Moyo, our President, may I invite you to the microphone. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Yandel. I appreciate the introductory words. And I'm very excited today, Prof. I can hear you are also energized. You are looking forward to the talk today. I'm certainly looking forward to the talk. The theme is very much in line with the inaugural address for the year, which was in the area of information and analytics and how we use this for improvements in business as well as entrepreneurial opportunities. So this is great. Today we are getting an example of provably beneficial artificial intelligence. How do we apply this for public benefit? So I'm very excited about this. I sincerely wish we could be joining face-to-face, but I'm sure one of these days we are going to have a Bernard Price Memorial Lecture in person at WITS. My job is quite simple. It is to introduce the speaker for the day, Professor Stuart Russell. And Professor Stuart Russell has kindly agreed to share with us his involvement in this exciting topic that is finding its way into every facet of our lives, artificial intelligence. Professor Stuart Russell is a professor of computer science at the University of California, Berkeley, holder of the Smith-Zadeh Chair in Engineering, and director of the Center for Human Compatible AI and the Kavli Center for Ethics, Science, and the Public. He is a recipient of the IJCAI Computers and Thought Award and Research Excellence. He has held the Chair Blair Cherie Blair, I suppose it is, this is French, Cherie Blair Pascal in Paris. In 2021, he received the OBE from the recently departed Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and gave the Wreath Lectures. He is an honorary fellow of Wadham College, Oxford, an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, and a fellow of the American Association of Artificial Intelligence, the Association for Computer Machinery, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. His book, Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach, with Peter Novick, is the standard text in AI, used in 1,500 universities in 135 countries. His research covers a wide range of topics in artificial intelligence, with a current emphasis on the long-term future of artificial intelligence and its relation to humanity. He has developed a new global seismic monitoring system for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and is currently working to ban lethal autonomous weapons. Provably beneficial artificial intelligence. Professor Stuart Russell, may I hand over to you?
Thank you very much, Prince Moyo, and also Ian Jandrell for the introductions. Thanks to the organizers and to SAIEE and WITS for inviting me. It's really a great honor to be asked to deliver this lecture in honor of Dr. Bernard Price. So my subject today is provably beneficial artificial intelligence. So in order to explain what that means, I first need to say what I mean by artificial intelligence. And of course, that means making intelligent machines. But what does that mean? And the standard model, the way we have thought about intelligence since the beginning of the field, can be summed up in a simple idea that machines are intelligent to the extent that their actions can be expected to achieve their objectives. And AI has many facets. Some of the oldest involve problem-solving algorithms, algorithms for satisfying constraints such as scheduling, for playing games, also algorithms for reasoning, representing knowledge with logic or probability theory, constructing plans, discourse in natural language, speech recognition, visual recognition, robotics, and a lot of it these days is underpinned by machine learning. And so if you've heard anything in the media in the last decade about AI, it's probably on the basis of advances in machine learning that have happened in the last 10 years or so. And since the beginning of the field, the goal is not these kinds of specific applications of AI, but general purpose AI, which means an AI system that could quickly learn to perform well, to outperform human beings in any task environment where the human intellect is relevant. And inevitably, systems with that capability, because of the massive advantages that machines have in terms of memory and bandwidth and processing speed, they would far exceed human capabilities in almost all areas. So the question that I've been asking actually since the first edition of my textbook in 1994 is, what happens if we succeed? And I think the availability of human level or superhuman general purpose AI would be perhaps the most significant technological event in the history of the human race. And we could imagine many ways that it would change society. But one simple thing we could do would be to do what we already know how to do, which is to deliver using our current understanding of the physics of the world and the biology of the world, to deliver that standard of living not just to a small fraction of the population on Earth, but to everyone on Earth. And if you work it out, a respectable sort of OECD standard of living applied to everyone on Earth would be about a 10-fold increase in the GDP of the world. And if you calculate the net present value of that, the sort of cash equivalent of that increased income stream, it comes to about $13.5 quadrillion. So that's a lower bound on the value of creating general purpose AI technology. And it makes all the investments that the world is currently putting into AI research look absolutely minuscule in comparison. And it creates an enormous amount of momentum towards creating this technology. Of course, we may also be able to do more than we currently know how to do. For example, because general purpose AI systems would be extremely low cost and can be multiplied as many times as you want, they could provide very high quality individualized healthcare, very high quality individualized education to every child. And they can also be used, as in fact is already happening, to dramatically accelerate the rate of progress in science. So in all these ways, AI could deliver a much better civilization than the one we have now. Of course, in doing so, it's inevitable that it will disrupt the human role in our economy and society. So this is something that policymakers are already starting to take very seriously, although it's a very difficult problem to figure out. But I'm not going to talk about those questions today. What I want to talk about is something that Alan Turing said. This is a picture of Alan Turing, who was the founder of computer science, with a paper he wrote in 1936. And of course, the Turing machine, which is the general mathematical abstraction of all computing devices, is named after him. And in 1951, he said the following: "It seems probable that once the machine thinking method had started, it would not take long to outstrip our feeble powers. At some stage, therefore, we should have to expect the machines to take control." And he offers no solution to this problem, also no apology. He just seems to be resigned to the loss of human control over our own future. So if we fast forward from 1951 to the present, we're seeing a lot of the kinds of technological applications of AI that Turing envisaged have already come to pass in the last few years. So for example, we now have self-driving cars. There are taxis driving around San Francisco with no driver taking passengers, and that's true in quite a few cities in the world now. We saw in 2016 AlphaGo defeat the human world champion Lee Sedol at Go, something that was predicted to take another 100 years and yet happened already. Of course, we're also seeing many, many misuses of artificial intelligence. Perhaps the most urgent in the very near future is the use of AI to kill people, which has already been happening with fully autonomous lethal weapons such as this cargo drone, which is already for sale. So I don't want to give you the impression that this technology, general purpose AI, is already available or is imminent, as many people are suggesting. So a lot of people think that it's just a matter of scaling up the size of the deep learning networks that we train, or the amount of data that we supply to train them. And I think that's not the case. And there are actually serious reasons to doubt that the current popular approach to AI, which is training these deep networks from large amounts of data, it's unlikely to create general purpose AI. And there are a few reasons for that. One is that these deep networks are essentially circuits rather than computer programs. And a circuit is a very restricted form of computer program and lacks expressive power. So what do I mean by that? It means if I want to write down even some fairly simple piece of knowledge, for example, the rules of the game of Go, those can be written in less than a page as a program, in less than a page in a formal language such as first-order logic. But in circuits, to write down the rules of Go requires millions of pages. And so what that means is that these simple concepts have enormous representations as circuits. And those enormous circuits require enormous quantities of data in order to train them. So that results in very slow learning and extreme fragility in the way those circuits behave. So when they encounter examples that are too different from what's in the training data, they often fail dramatically. And we see that in so-called adversarial examples. So these are examples that are presented to the network. For example, an image, and we ask the network to classify the image as a particular type of object. And it's been shown that you can take a photograph of a school bus and the network recognizes it correctly as a school bus, and you can make tiny invisible changes to a few pixels in that image. And now the network is convinced that this school bus is in fact an ostrich, or any other category that you choose. You can cause the network to misclassify the image by making these tiny changes. So this is a symptom that the circuits are not correctly generalizing from their training data. And in fact, some people have shown, this is a group at MIT, have shown that in fact, the circuits, the deep networks that recognize images in the ImageNet dataset, which is the standard dataset for training image recognizers, are often not looking at the object at all. So if you look at the parachute in the top left, when a human looks at that picture and recognizes it as a parachute, they look at the person dangling beneath, they look at the shape of the thing they're dangling from, and the fact that it's up in the air, and they conclude that there's a parachute there. If you look at the bottom left, that shows the pixels that the deep learning network is actually looking at. So it's only looking at sky pixels. And if those pixels in the image are sky, in other words, they're the right color of blue, then the network concludes that there must be a parachute in the image. And the gray pixels in that picture could be anything at all. I could have a picture of the moon or a picture of Donald Trump or anything else there, and it would still conclude that this image is an image of a parachute. So the networks are picking up on spurious regularities in the training data in order to recognize objects. And we see this in real-world applications. For example, there are 7 companies that have deployed products in the real world that claim to be able to detect skin cancer of various kinds. And as far as I understand it, every one of those products has now been withdrawn from the market because it was found that in the real world, their classification capabilities were far lower than they believed based on training in the lab. And here's another example. This was when it came out, a very impressive example of what's called reinforcement learning, where a system learns a successful behavior simply by reward and punishment. So here we have 2 simulated human robots, and they began life as essentially newborn babies, lying on the ground and only able to make random motions of their limbs. And the team at OpenAI used their deep reinforcement learning technology to train those algorithms to actually play football, as you can see. And imagine if a newborn baby 2 hours after it was born was running around in the back garden playing football with its brother. You would be somewhat terrified if that happened, but that was what they demonstrated. But some of my students were skeptical about how robust this behavior really is. And so they left the blue program, the goal scorer, unchanged. So they didn't change the blue program at all. And they just said, maybe we can come up with a kind of adversarial behavior by the goalkeeper. And so this is what the adversarial behavior looks like. It consists of just falling down on the ground and waggling his leg in the air. And now you see that the blue player is no longer able to play football at all. In fact, in many cases, he completely fails to get to the ball. Here he kicks it straight at the goalkeeper, and so on. So these networks, despite very, very impressive behavior, are actually far less capable than we believe them to be, because we overinterpret success on examples that are very similar to the training data. And this point has not been lost on deep learning researchers. Here's a quote from Francois Chollet, who is the creator of the Keras deep learning package, a very popular system for machine learning, an author of a very well-known textbook on the subject. And in the last chapter, he concludes that many applications are completely out of range for current deep learning techniques, even given vast amounts of human annotated data. And the main directions in which he sees promise are closer to general purpose computer programs rather than circuits. And it turns out there is in fact another subdiscipline of artificial intelligence called probabilistic programming, which began with a paper from a couple of my students in 1997. And the idea there is to combine probability theory, which is our mathematical theory of evidence and prediction, with the expressive power that's available from Turing machines or general purpose computer programs. And so you can combine probability theory with various kinds of programming languages, or with formal mathematical languages such as first order logic. And as I mentioned before, in these kinds of languages, the rules of Go can be expressed in one page instead of a million pages. And that means that we can fairly easily write complex models for handling real world data in complex systems quite easily. And I'll give you an example in a moment. And with these formal languages, these probabilistic programs, any probability model that can be written in any language can be written concisely in one of these languages. That's the notion of universality that we inherit from Turing machines. And we can write inference algorithms, that's algorithms for reasoning and for learning from data that are general purpose. In other words, for any model, for any data, and for any query that we might want to ask, that algorithm can eventually answer that question. And the field has really exploded in recent years. So in 2021, there were more than 2,500 probabilistic programming papers published. So let me give you an example. This is the monitoring system for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or the Ctbt, which Prince Moyo mentioned. And so how does the Ctbt monitoring system work? So it starts with a global network of detector stations, mostly seismic stations, all over the world. And those stations produce raw data, seismic data, for example, coming from the seismic detectors. But there are also hydroacoustic underwater detectors, and there are infrasound atmospheric detectors. So from this raw data, which is then fed by a satellite network to the headquarters in Vienna, we have to produce a daily bulletin which gives a list of all the seismic events that happened in the world, how big they were, where they happened, how deep they were, and we flag the ones that are suspicious, which are typically very shallow events that happen in areas that are not known to be naturally seismically active. So if we formulate this as a probabilistic reasoning problem, the evidence are those waveforms that are coming from all of those seismic stations around the world. The query is what happened, what were the seismic events that could explain all of this data. And just to give you a sense of how difficult this is, there are more than 10,000 detections on a typical day, and more than 90% of those are false alarms in that they don't represent any significant seismic event. They're more like local noise or instrument noise. And then we can provide knowledge in the form of the probabilistic program, which captures the elementary geophysics of how seismic events occur, where they typically occur, how seismic signals are transmitted from events to the stations, how those stations detect the events, and how much noise they're subject to. We can write down this model in a very concise way. Here it is. So this is the code for the global monitoring system for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It's very short. A geophysicist, I'm not going to go through it in any detail, but a geophysicist can read this fairly easily and understand what it's actually saying. All the details of the model can be trained very quickly from historical data, and the resulting system is far more accurate and far more sensitive than anything that the seismology area had produced in the previous 100 years. And this shows one detection. This is a satellite image from North Korea, and this shows the detection of a North Korean nuclear test with a very accurate localization of exactly where it took place. So, as I said, we still have a long way to go before reaching human-level artificial intelligence. And there are some major things we don't understand how to do. We don't really know how to build systems that actually understand language as opposed to being able to produce the appearance of understanding language as current systems do. We would like systems that know how to integrate what they know already with new information that they can learn from in the way that, for example, scientists learn from their experimental results. And probably the biggest thing that humans are wonderful at, that machines are terrible at, is long-range thinking. The idea that we manage our activity as humans at many, many levels of abstraction, all the way from the motor control signals that we send to our fingers when we're typing or to our vocal apparatus when we're speaking, all the way to multi-year decisions like deciding to do a PhD or deciding to move to a different country. And at every level in between, and all of these levels are managed seamlessly in human decision-making, and that enables us to manage and control the world in ways that are far beyond anything that AI systems can currently do. So it's very hard to predict when we're going to have the necessary breakthroughs that allow AI systems to reach human-level AI. And to give you an example of how unpredictable these kinds of breakthroughs are, I actually want to go back in history to the last time we invented a civilization-ending technology. So in 1905, with the publication of special relativity by Einstein and the E=mc² equation, we could calculate exactly how much energy would be available if we were able to convert one type of atom into another. So we know the mass, what's called the mass defect, as you go from, as you merge helium atoms to make carbon, as you merge hydrogen to make helium, or if you split uranium into its smaller atoms. But for the first 28 years after that, the physics establishment was pretty unanimous that this could not be done. And September 11th, Lord Rutherford, who was the leading nuclear physicist of his time, said in answer to a question about whether we might be able to find or access this atomic energy, anyone who looks for a source of power in the transformation of the atoms is talking moonshine. So the next morning, Leo Szilard was reading about this speech in the Times. He was sitting in a hotel in London, and he went for a walk, and he invented the neutron-induced nuclear chain reaction. So something that the physics establishment believed was impossible was actually solved about 16 hours later. So it's very, I think, foolish to assume that we won't have these breakthroughs that will create human-level AI. We have to work on the assumption that eventually, even if it's not imminent, but eventually AI systems will be able to make better real-world decisions than humans. And this is what Alan Turing was worried about. And another way of putting his concern is this, right? We're going to create machines that are more powerful than human beings. And how do we retain power over entities that are more powerful than us forever? And I believe Turing thought about the question that way and answered the question negatively. He could not think of how that might be done. And so he believed that we would eventually lose control. So should we just give up? Should we ban artificial intelligence altogether? Not yet. I think we actually could try to understand where the problem comes from. And I think the problem actually comes from the standard model of AI that I mentioned at the beginning. Machines whose actions can be expected to achieve their objectives. And this standard model is actually common to many other areas. Control theory, where you minimize a cost function. Statistics, where you minimize a loss function. In operations research, you maximize a reward function, or you minimize a cost. In economics, you maximize an expected utility. So in all these disciplines, the idea is that we create this kind of optimizing machinery. We specify the objective, and then off it goes. And that's been fairly effective, and you can see that these disciplines are a big part of 20th century technology. But what happens is that in the real world, when we try to specify these objectives, we find ourselves unable to do it completely and correctly. So for example, in economics, it's very well understood by economists that GDP, gross domestic product, is not a particularly good measure of what it is that government should be trying to optimize. But we stick with it because we built a bunch of measurement machinery around it, and people expect governments to improve GDP, but it actually leads to all kinds of distortions in policy. This story goes back actually much further. So this is King Midas, the legendary Greek king. And he said, I want everything I touch to turn to gold. And that was the objective that he stated, and that was what the gods optimized for him. And then, of course, his food and his drink and his family all turn to gold, and he dies in misery and starvation. The same story in The Sorcerer's Apprentice, where the apprentice asks the brooms to fetch water, but forgets to specify the amount of water. And of course, if you have a genie who grants you the 3 wishes, right, we know that the 3rd wish is always, please undo the first 2 wishes because I've ruined the universe. So this is not a new story, but it's a real problem. And to see that it's already a real problem, even with the very simple AI systems that we currently have, let's look at what happens with social media. So the algorithms in social media, the so-called recommender systems, that control the cognitive intake of billions of human beings for hours every day, those algorithms are designed to maximize click-through, the probability that the user clicks on the recommended item, or engagement, the amount of time that the user engages with the system. And you might think, well, in order to get the user to click on things, the algorithm has to learn what people want, and that seems like a good thing. In fact, you might say that there's some alignment between the preferences of the users and the financial goals of the platforms. But in fact, this, as we know, this is not what happened. And many commentators have pointed out that the result of trying to maximize click-through is that you amplify clickbait because you care about clicks, not about whether they actually enjoyed or benefited from reading the article. And you create filter bubbles because the algorithm only sends you things that it knows you're already interested in. And so the viewpoint of each user becomes narrower and narrower. But actually, it's far worse than that, because neither of these things is the optimal solution for maximizing click-through. And if you know anything about, for example, operations research or reinforcement learning, maximizing click-through is not achieved by sending the next item that is most likely to be clicked on. It's actually achieved by modifying the environment of the algorithm so that in the long run, it creates the largest number of clicks. The environment of the algorithm is the human brain, the brain of the user, And therefore, the optimal solution is to modify the brain of the user so that in the long run, the user is more predictable, because a more predictable user is one who can be sent content that they're more likely to click on. And so this is really what the algorithms are doing, is essentially manipulating human beings to turn them into more predictable and in many cases, I think, more extreme versions of themselves so that they can maximize revenue in the long term. And these are very, very simple algorithms, right? If the algorithms were better at doing their job, the outcome would be far worse. They would be much more capable. They would understand our psychology. They would understand the content of what they're sending, neither of which are currently true. And they would be much more effective at manipulating people. So the outcome for the human race would be far, far worse. So you see this basic problem, and we can actually show this with some fairly simple mathematical theorems, that the better you make the AI, the worse the outcome for human beings. So that's a sign that the entire model, the entire approach of optimizing fixed objectives is fundamentally flawed when we move out of artificial examples and into the real world. So I think we need a new model. So this was the existing model, and I think we have to get rid of it. We want a different model which says that machines are beneficial to the extent that their actions can be expected to achieve our objectives, not the objectives that are in the machine, but the objectives that are really within us as human beings. And those objectives may not be explicit. We may, in some cases, not even be aware of them, or we may be uncertain about what they really are. But this is what we actually want. We don't want machines that are intelligent in their own right. We want them to be beneficial to us, not to cockroaches, not to aliens, but to us, the human beings who are making them. So this is a more difficult problem because the machine doesn't have explicit access to the objectives, but nonetheless, it is actually something that we can still handle with a mathematical framework. And in English, the mathematical framework looks like this, right? First of all, the robot has an objective, which is to satisfy human preferences. And I put a little asterisk to remind me to say that when I mean preferences, I don't just mean, well, what kind of pizza do you like, or which football team do you support, or I should say, which cricket team do you support, but what are your preferences about all possible complete futures? So this is the use of preferences that's in sort of von Neumann-Morgenstern decision theory, if you're familiar with that. So it's a very comprehensive, all-embracing notion of preferences about futures. But the key point, number two, is that the robot knows that it does not know what those preferences are. The third point is simply a way of grounding this connection between the human and the robot, and how does information about human preferences flow. And it says that essentially it's our behavior that provides evidences about our true preferences about the future. It's often imperfect. Our behavior is often mistaken, emotional, myopic, etc., etc. But that's the source of evidence. So you can take those English principles and define what's called an assistance game, which is, so it's a game in the sense of game theory, meaning a decision problem that involves two or more entities, at least one human, at least one machine. And you can actually then, once you have that mathematical definition of the game, you can calculate the solutions of that game, and you can examine how the two entities, the human and the machine, play when they are given this game to solve. And from the robot point of view, we find that indeed the robot will defer to the human because the human preferences are what matters, and anything the human says is conveying information about those preferences. If the machine wants to do something that might affect aspects of the world about which it's not sure about our preferences, for example, you know, if it's a climate engineering machine and it comes up with a way of normalizing carbon dioxide, but that turns the oceans into sulfuric acid. If it doesn't know our preferences about the oceans, then it would ask permission Is it okay if I turn the oceans into sulfuric acid before actually doing it? And that's very important. And in the extreme case, it wants to be switched off if humans want it to be switched off, because it wants to avoid doing whatever it is that would cause the human to want to switch it off. And we can prove within this framework that it's rational for humans to build machines that solve these assistance games. And within this framework, if you improve the quality of the AI decision making, you get better outcomes because it's better at learning our preferences and as well as being better at fulfilling them in a cautious way. So that's one possible answer to Turing's concern, that we actually have to rebuild AI on a completely different foundation. We have to get away from this idea that we begin with a fixed objective that the algorithm is going to optimize. So to just illustrate that in a way that I'm sure all of you are already familiar with, let's imagine this, this real-life assistance game. So you are in the role of the robot. So you're supposed to be keeping the human happy. And your partner, whoever it is, wife, husband, boyfriend, girlfriend, is the human. So you need to keep the human happy. And their birthday is coming up. And so you have to buy your partner the perfect birthday present. And in order to take money out of this, we'll have the money come from the joint account. And your payoff in this game, of course, is precisely how happy your partner is going to be with the present. And of course, the problem is you don't know how happy your partner is going to be with the present. And you've made many mistakes in the past and had to take things back. And there's various strategies you could employ. You could ask your partner's friends. You could sort of leave pictures around the house and hope that they point to one of them and say, "Oh, that looks nice," and so on. So it's a very difficult problem. And in fact, in the general case, right, we know this is an unsolvable instance. But in fact, we've shown that with certain exceptions, assistance games do all have solutions, and so they can be solved by actual algorithms. So I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to page through this very quickly. This shows you why it is that a robot that is solving an assistance game will allow itself to be switched off. And this is really the core of the control problem, because if we can't switch the machine off, and this is something that actually Alan Turing pointed out in another talk, if we can't switch the machine off, then all bets are off, game is over. And the problem with the classical model, the standard model of AI, is if we give the machine even a very simple objective like please fetch the coffee, it doesn't have to be a genius to realize that if someone switches it off, it's not going to be able to fetch the coffee. So you can't fetch the coffee if you're dead. And so as soon as we've given it that fixed objective, we've given it an incentive to disable its own off switch, which then means that we've lost control. So we want to avoid that. And in the new formulation, where the machine is uncertain about objectives, it won't behave that way. And I'm actually going to skip over this, but there is a mathematical proof that looks at a simplified version of this game and shows that, in fact, the robot has a positive incentive to allow itself to be switched off only if it's initially uncertain about whether the human wants to switch it off or not. As soon as it's certain about the human's preferences, then it loses the incentive to allow itself to be switched off. So there's this absolutely central coupling between uncertainty about human objectives and the control that the human has over the machine. So that theory that I sketched, this idea of assistance games as a new foundation for artificial intelligence, has many, many elaborations that we're currently exploring. So one of the first elaborations has to do with the fact that the machine is making decisions not on behalf of one person, but really on behalf of everybody. And this then brings up many questions that have been studied in moral philosophy and economics for thousands of years. We have to think about not just one machine, but many machines, make sure that they don't have unanticipated interactions with each other. We have to deal with the fact that when humans behave, that behavior provides evidence of their underlying preferences, but that evidence is noisy and partial because humans are not perfect, right? Their behavior doesn't perfectly reflect their true underlying preferences about the future. We have to rebuild the foundations of AI because every chapter of the textbook begins by saying, okay, let's assume that there is a fixed objective in the following form, right? And then how do we write algorithms that achieve the fixed objective? But if that goes away, then all your algorithms are invalid, all your theorems are invalid, and you need a completely new way of approaching the problem. So let me just briefly talk about many humans and what kinds of questions come up. So the first question, of course, is what about the fact that each person's preferences may be different from those of others? So that doesn't, it turns out, cause any particular problem. And there are solutions in economics and philosophy where basically you treat everyone's preferences as equal and you try to satisfy them all as well as possible. And what as well as possible means, there are slight variations on that, but that's the basic idea. How do you make those trade-offs? And the answers are still disputed, but basically you add up the preferences and try to maximize the sum of the preferences. That approach in itself leads to questions about how do we actually measure the relative strength of preferences held by different individuals. And some economists have argued that actually there's no meaning to interpersonal comparisons of preferences. But I think in practice, we understand that there are reasonable ways to compare human preferences. There are issues about aggregating the preferences of individuals when those individuals have different beliefs, and I'll illustrate that in a minute. And then there are famous problems studied since the 19th century on actions that affect not just the preferences of individuals, but actually which individuals even exist. So actions that affect the size of the population. And this is illustrated in one of the Avengers movies. So Thanos, that's this guy, has a plan to get rid of half the people in the universe on the grounds that if he did that, the remaining half would be more than twice as happy. So he thinks he's being a good utilitarian, increasing the total happiness in the universe by getting rid of half the people. So we don't want AI systems to make that kind of mistake, if it is a mistake, let's assume it is. And so we actually need to solve these philosophical problems because AI systems, in a sense, are soon going to have that kind of power. So there are many other questions. How do we deal with preferences, not about our own benefits, but about the lives of others? How do we handle, for example, sadistic preferences, relative preferences such as pride and envy? So I mentioned the aggregation of human preferences when we have different beliefs among individuals. And there's a standard theorem due to Harsanyi, and it's called the social aggregation theorem, which says that assuming that everyone has the same belief about the future, you can prove that every Pareto optimal policy of how you decide on behalf of the collection of humans. So Pareto optimal here means not dominate, in other words, not obviously stupid. So every not obviously stupid policy has to optimize a linear combination of the preferences of the individuals. But unfortunately, that theorem is not true when the individuals have different beliefs about the future. And we've shown that in that case, the optimal policies, all the non-stupid policies, have to give weight to the preferences of individuals that's proportional to how well the beliefs of each individual turn out to match the actual future. So if your predictions about the future are going to be correct, we're going to give you higher weight in future for your preferences rather than the preferences of others, which seems to be very, very unfair. But in fact, everyone loves this policy because everyone thinks their own predictions are going to turn out to be true by definition. Otherwise, they wouldn't be making those predictions. And so everyone insists on this policy compared to a policy that weights everyone's preferences equally. So this is a mathematical theorem that suggests that we have a bit of a problem with a potential kind of inequality that hasn't yet been considered. So I think I'm going to just skip over that and point to a couple of books if you're interested in more of these questions. There's a non-technical book on the left called Human Compatible, or if you want the technical side, the 4th edition of the AI textbook has a lot of the new work, although most of the meat of the book is still working within the standard model. So to summarize, I think AI has enormous momentum and vast potential to benefit the human race. But if we pursue it within the standard model, then we will eventually lose control over those increasingly intelligent systems. They will pursue these incorrectly defined objectives, and then that will lead to a conflict, a kind of game of chess, if you like, that we are guaranteed to lose. If we take a different approach, if we work on systems that know that they don't know what the objective is, then we get this idea of provably beneficial AI, and we can show that this is actually a desirable form of technology. So I don't want you to go away with the feeling that this is a talk about the ethics of AI. This is really a talk about AI. It's about how the systems of the future should be built, because it's just better technology rather than being sort of ethically superior technology. And there are a couple of problems that you're probably thinking about already. One is misuse. So how do we know that people are going to use provably beneficial methods instead of the bad old methods? We call that the Dr. Evil problem. And then there's the problem of overuse. So in the film Wall-E, it shows a future where AI systems are running our civilization very successfully, but of course that leaves nothing for the humans to do, and they become infantilized and enfeebled as a result. And that's something that our culture is going to have to figure out. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the thought-provoking presentation, Professor Russell. As put in the chat box there, we do encourage you to ask questions. Our attendees that are attending, we encourage that you ask the questions and they will be answered. We do have one question already, and it is from Prince Moyo. Okay. So the question goes, it's as follows, Prof. He says he agrees that humans do well with long-range thinking. What is your view on machines and humanistic empathy?
Empathy, that's a great question. So I think this is one area where humans have an advantage that, as far as I can tell, will never be matched by machines. So for example, if I want to know what it's like for you to hit your thumb with a hammer, right? I don't have to do a PhD in neuroscience, and I don't have to measure your brain. I can just hit my thumb with a hammer, and then I know what it's like. So I can empathize directly because you and I share the same type of nervous system, and presumably our subjective experience in similar circumstances is very similar. But machines have no subjective experience at all. So they could hit their thumb with a hammer and nothing would happen except that their hand wouldn't be working anymore. So in areas where empathy is required, for example, in any kind of therapeutic profession, any notion of real friendship and caring, humans have this intrinsic advantage. And I think that in the long run, that's going to be the primary focus of human activity in society, replacing a lot of the boring jobs that a lot of people have to do with jobs that involve direct person-to-person relationships where empathy is a big factor.
Thank you for that, Professor Russell. Here is another question here from Ian Craig. It goes as follows, that by not giving AI systems an array of preferences, aren't we exposing the AI system to develop a database of possible outcomes, which improves their efficiency, thereby leading to manipulation of humans in the future?
So I think I can see why one might think that, but you have to remember the first rule. If I remember, there were 3 principles. So the first principle is that the robot's only goal is the satisfaction of human preferences. So that means that actually the machine has no preferences of its own at all. So it might well want to, for example, get better at answering questions, maybe to be faster, have more computing power or more memory or more data, but only to the extent that that's going to be helpful to human beings. So it won't, so some people, talk about this dystopic scenario where the machine consumes all the resources on Earth simply in order to improve its own decision-making capability. But that would not happen because it knows that we don't want it to do that, right? We want most of the resources on Earth actually to be for us and for other living species and not for computers. So I think that the formulation that I've given avoids that type of problem. Although there is, as I say, there's still this sort of instrumental incentive to improve decision-making capabilities.
Thank you, Professor. The next one comes from Hagai Sitole, and he asks, are there any comments on the morals of eugenics?
Are there any comments on the morals of eugenics? Well, I don't have anything to say other than that. I think the motivations of many of the eugenicists in the early 20th century were suspect, and I think that's putting it politely. So I think to broaden it, or to get to broaden the question to general issues about the future of the human race, I do think that AI is going to bring a lot of the questions about the future of the human race into focus, because for most of history, it's been about how do I not die, right? How do I find enough food to eat? How do I defend myself against people who want to kill me or animals who want to kill me? And so on, dealing with natural disasters, all the rest. And with artificial intelligence, I hope, if things go well, politically and economically, then we'll actually enter a new phase where the human race really has much more of a choice about what kind of future we want. And that's both good and bad. It puts an obligation on us to think hard about what that means. And how does that intersect with what I've talked about? It actually intersects in the assumption that I've made that in some sense the preferences of a human being are kind of fixed and autonomous, right? That somehow we just sprang into being with the preferences that we as individuals have about the future. But of course that's not the case, right? Our preferences came about, each of us, because of the upbringing we had and the society we live in, and maybe even some particular peculiarities of our own biology. But there's no sense in which those preferences were autonomously acquired. And so that leaves open then the question, should AI systems try to satisfy the preferences that people actually have, or the preferences that we should have? And a lot of philosophers are arguing that actually we should think about, what is a more ideal set of preferences about the future, and that gets you into a very long discussion, and I don't have a way of answering those questions, but I acknowledge that there is a real question there to be answered.
Thank you, Professor. The next question comes from Ndibuo Makondo. He asks, what do you think is the role of deep learning, if any, as a component in our goal of a general purpose AI? And what do you think about approaches that aim to combine learning from deep learning and reasoning from symbolic AI, such as neuro-symbolic AI approaches?
It's a great question. Yeah, I'm actually pursuing some of these integrated approaches myself in my own group, and it's a very natural. There are many technical solutions to how you combine, for example, the probabilistic programming technology with deep learning. And I think that there are places where there really isn't any kind of internal symbolic structure to a particular decision process. So to give you an example, right, if I say two words, cat and cut, and then I ask you, how did you tell the difference, right? How can you tell the difference between those two vowel sounds, the A and the U? There's no symbolic explanation for that, right? It's just that we've trained our own biological neural circuits to recognize that distinction, and people who grow up in other linguistic environments recognize different sound pairs than we can. And so there's no harm in using deep learning for sub-problems in the overall cognitive architecture where there isn't any clear symbolic substructure to the explanation. But when you think about, for example, the kinds of scientific achievements that the human race has produced, and in my book, Human Compatible, I give the example of the gravitational wave detector, right? And the gravitational wave detector builds on symbolic knowledge that was accumulated by scientists over hundreds of years, and they end up using it to detect an event that happened 1.2 billion years ago on the other side of the universe. And it's absolutely incredible that we're able to do that. And there's absolutely no plausible explanation that says that deep learning systems could ever do that. I mean, there aren't any training examples of gravitational wave detectors, and so it's not even clear how deep learning would get off the ground with that kind of question. So it's clear to me that that real intelligent behavior has to have this level of symbolic reasoning, of acquisition of knowledge in a cumulative way that deep learning systems per se don't exhibit.
Thank you, Professor. The next question is from Andrew Agbamuche, and he asks, by not giving AI systems an array of references, aren't you exposing the AI system to develop a database of possible outcomes which improves their efficiency, thereby leading to manipulations of humans in the future?
Okay, I think I already answered that question. I think we did that one already. I think he must have put it in twice into the question panel.
Good. And the next one is from, I think Ian Craig, we've done that one. So Jeffrey Heinebach. The literature shows that nations are already working on autonomous weapons. How will this be gotten under control before it becomes catastrophic?
That's a good question. So this is something I've been working on now for nearly a decade, and I have to say, I don't think we're in a better position now than we were 10 years ago. I think we're in a worse position because the technology, as I mentioned, is already available, and it will become miniaturized. It will become much cheaper, and the real threat is not the autonomous submarine or the autonomous fighter plane, but is the small anti-personnel weapon, which you could think of as the size of a dragonfly or something like that, and you could put millions of those into a regular container, and then you have a weapon. If you launch all of those weapons at once, you have something that is as powerful as a as a hydrogen bomb, but much cheaper, much easier to build, much easier to buy on the open market. And it would be an absolutely terrible world to live in. Imagine a world where anyone could go and buy a nuclear weapon in the supermarket. That would not be a world I would want to live in, and none of us would be able to live in that world for very long before it went kablooey. So, so I've been trying to convince governments to focus not on the ethical issues of autonomous weapons, which are real, but I don't think that's the main question. The main question is this common sense question. Do you want to be selling weapons of mass destruction in the arms supermarkets of the world, which is what's already happening? And to me, the answer has to be no, but at the moment, Russia and the United States are blocking any discussion of a treaty in Geneva for reasons, I think, mainly of suspicion, that they are suspicious of each other, and they don't trust that even if there was a treaty, that the other side would stick to it. And I think this is really unfortunate. I think we should be discussing methods of verification, inspection, and a very strong ban, at the very least, on anti-personnel autonomous weapons.
And there's one that's almost related to it here from Sansriti Ranjan. On a different note, AI is being utilized in exoskeletons and a lot of research is being undertaken. Would we see a future where robots are deployed on the battlefield instead of soldiers, and what ethics would play here?
Yeah, so I think exoskeleton brings up the notion of the Terminator robot, which does look like a very large human skeleton made of steel. I honestly don't imagine that autonomous weapons are going to be designed that way. First of all, bipedal robots are very unstable, not particularly fast compared to quadrupedal robots. And it's just not a good design. I think most people are looking at flying weapons because they're much more agile, much faster, and much cheaper. As I said, if we go in this direction, the main concern from my point of view is the large swarm of flying, small anti-personnel drones, which could wipe out entire cities, but also doing it in a selective way. So you can wipe out just the subpopulation that you want to kill. And also you don't have to destroy all the buildings, and you don't leave a huge radioactive crater behind. So they have many advantages over nuclear weapons as weapons of mass destruction. So I'm still trying to convince countries that they have to do this. And I'm not sure where South Africa stands. I know that the non-aligned movement in general has come out strongly in favor of a treaty. I'm not sure what the South African position currently is, but it would be good if the government could support this position.
Thank you, Prof. Next one is from Farai Kambarami. One of the challenges with current approaches to NLP problems is that they privilege English and well-resourced languages due to the abundance of data in those languages. Whilst machine translation could be a way to remedy this, a lot is lost in translation. Would you see the probabilistic approach as a way to remedy this? If not, how do you think that this could be remedied?
So lots of great questions. So I actually do think that the probabilistic approach could help enormously. And I used to say I work in every area of AI except for natural language, and then I wrote a natural language paper in 2016. If you're interested, it's called the physics of text, and essentially arguing that the way we're going about natural language systems currently is broken, because essentially we're saying the reason that the particular words are at that particular place on the page is because the previous words were on the page. And that's not the reason, right? The reason the words are on the page there is because someone wanted to say something about the world. And I was able to show using probabilistic programs that even a very simple probabilistic program can learn from a very small number of examples an unknown language. So I don't have to have any translation to a known language. In fact, in theory, we could do this with an alien language from another part of the universe. So it can quickly learn the language, how it works, and what the sentences mean, and what claims are being made by the text about the world. And I think that because it worked from so few examples, would be useful for the languages where there isn't nearly as much digitized text as there is for English and Chinese and so on. And I'm familiar with the complaint that you're making, and I think it's absolutely correct. And I know, for example, I'm on the board of a natural language company in France, and although there's a reasonable amount of French text that's been digitized, there's so much more English text that they build their systems by translating French into English, answering the questions in English, translating the answer back into French, and then giving it to the user. And that turns out to be the most effective approach, which is, it really shouldn't be that way. The system should be operating directly in the native language. And I hope, as the questioner suggests, that techniques based on a more sort of knowledge-based and evidence-based understanding of language will be much more effective.
Thank you, Professor. A quick one here from Lindoku Kwanazi. As far as the security of the programs used in the bots or AI, how far ahead should we be in terms of guarding against threat?
Another great question. I feel like if I had put my mind to it, I couldn't have written a better set of questions than this. So I think there are two major issues. So one is, are the AI systems that we're building vulnerable to various kinds of attacks? And I showed this idea of adversarial examples, which are just very small modifications in an image that can cause the system to change its classification of what it sees. And this has been demonstrated in the real world, by putting little bits of tape on a stop sign, for example. You can cause the system to think that it's a 45-mile-an-hour sign instead of a stop sign, which would be obviously very dangerous. And these techniques are now pretty robust. They can survive being deployed in the real world, going through fax machines and photocopiers and all kinds of things. So that's one set of problems. And the same techniques can be used for speech. So you can modify speech so that from the human point of view, the speech is still absolutely the same, but the machine interprets it as something completely different. So you can imagine, defrauding any system that engages with human beings using voice in order to conduct transactions can be defrauded in ways that are undetectable to any human inspector. So that's pretty bad. We can do this with fax machines. So you can do handwritten digits on a fax machine, and you can make tiny modifications to them so that the OCR, the optical character recognition system at the other end, reads the incorrect digits, even though from a human point of view, it still looks the same. So all of these are ways that AI-based systems can be attacked. But to me, the real issue is the one I mentioned at the end of the talk, what I call the Dr. Evil problem, right? How do we ensure that as we develop systems that are really, really powerful, that we only use these provably safe AI system designs, right? We have to prevent the deployment of unsafe AI system designs. So what does that mean? It means, in some sense, that we need a way of certifying that the systems are designed according to these safe principles. So there's a whole technology of program verification that is now, I would say, fairly powerful. We're able to verify whole operating systems, for example. So we need verification that the system that's running on the hardware actually satisfies the design requirements for safety. And we need all hardware systems of sufficient scale to enforce those requirements. So we need certifying hardware, certifying networks, and then software that basically carries with it a proof that it is in fact safe. And so that's a set of technologies, each of which is being developed, but we are nowhere near the necessary scale of deployment and universal acceptance that this is how hardware systems should be developed. And in fact, if you look at what's happening with cybercrime, I was reading on the web the other day that the cost of cybercrime to the world is currently about $6 trillion a year, which is far more than we're talking about for saving the world from global warming, right? So that's the scale of the problem. It's much bigger than the software industry. It's much bigger than the hardware industry, and yet we tolerate it for reasons that I don't understand. So we have a big sort of social change that needs to take place in the way we regulate our digital world because we let things get out of control.
Thank you, Prof. Sorry, had a bit of a hiccup there. Next one is from Yuchi Yen. What are your thoughts on the human role or career in the future? It has been suggested that creative pursuits and human caregiving will become more prevalent, perhaps even more valuable. What does that mean for the more technical human pursuits such as engineering and STEM? Science,
Okay.
technology, engineering.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the question. Can you say it again?
Sorry, Professor, I will read it better. What are your thoughts on the human role or career in the future? It has been suggested that creative pursuits and human caregiving will become more prevalent, perhaps even more valuable. What does that mean for more technical human pursuits, such as engineering and STEM? Science, technology, engineering, and math.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I basically agree that that's the direction things are going to go. And I'm not quite sure about the creative pursuits. I think there's significant concern now among artists and musicians that AI systems are able to do so much of the work of composition that they're worried that their livelihood will be threatened because completely untrained people can now produce very professional looking art and very professional sounding musical composition. So I think that's going to be something that plays out over the next 10 years or so. But in the long run, I think the likely direction is person-to-person professions. And so when governments say, oh, we're just going to retrain everyone who's put out of work by machines, we'll just retrain them as data scientists and robot engineers. I hear this quite a bit. But the world needs a few million data scientists, not a few billion data scientists. And so there's just no possibility that we can solve the coming economic dislocation by retraining people to be data scientists and robot engineers. So I'm not. I think in the short run, yes, I think people are moving into STEM disciplines, and we're seeing this dramatically, at least in American universities. But I think in the longer run, actually, it should go the other way. That the humanistic disciplines are the ones where people will find their future. But at the same time, I think the humanistic disciplines, as they currently constituted, don't think of themselves that way, right? They don't think of themselves as really preparing people for a career in the humanistic discipline. They're much more sort of introverted than that. So both sides have to go through a dramatic change, and as we know, dramatic change in academia takes hundreds of years.
Thank you, Professor. Our last question for tonight, ladies and gentlemen, those questions that the professor, we didn't have time for to being answered, we will ask the professor to answer those and we'll upload it on the SAIEE website for your information. Our last question tonight is from Francis Fowler asking, what are the dangers of one generation developing irreversible AI actions that will be contrary to the preferences of a later generation?
Well, this is another one of those very, very difficult questions that philosophers have been grappling with, sometimes called intergenerational equity. If we're making decisions now, how do we take into account the preferences of people who don't yet exist? And there's a philosophical trend called long-termism, which attempts to take into account, generations far into the future, on the assumption that, as we develop interstellar travel, future generations may be much, much larger, by many orders of magnitude than the current human population. And so, if we make a mess now, and they never come into being, that's an enormous loss in terms of future value. I think these are very difficult questions to answer. One obvious point is that, if every successive generation is, twice as big as the previous generation, that means that every generation is going to be giving up almost all of its own utility in order to benefit future generations, which would mean that that humanity lives in misery forever, because we're always giving up everything in terms of benefit to the future. But if you think about, we have been giving up. Every time we build a building that's going to last for more than a few decades, we're actually giving that benefit to future generations. When we create universities, knowing that they're going to last for hundreds of years, and we provide massive investment and endowment into those universities, we're doing that not just for the present, but for the future. So this idea has been around, since almost the beginning of time, that future generations do matter, but understanding how exactly to make those trade-offs and how to prevent, as the questioner says, how to prevent the irreversible actions that would condemn future generations to perhaps even to non-existence. That's really hard. And so the long-termists argue that absolutely the highest priority is to avoid those irreversible actions that would lead to human extinction, because it's that extinction, even if it's in 100 years' time, is a catastrophic loss, even to our present point of view. So this is one of the reasons why I'm working on making sure that AI is not responsible for human extinction. Of course, there are other things that could also lead to human extinction, and we need to prioritize those as well.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'd like to now introduce our Senior Vice President, Mr. Pascal Motswasele, who's going to do the vote of thanks. Engineer Pascal Motswasele is a fellow of the SAIEE and the current Senior Vice President. He has been a member for 24 years and has taken leadership roles within various structures of the SAIEE over the past 10 years. Currently, he chairs the SAIEE's Governance Committee. Over to you, Pascal.
Right. Thank you, Minx. My apologies. I'm sitting in the dark here. We are with load shedding at the moment in my area. I hope you can see me. So on behalf of the South African Institute of Electrical Engineers and on behalf of the Wits University, I wish to thank Prof. Russell for such an interesting and thought-provoking lecture. I believe there's still a lot of thought and research that we as humans still need to embark on regarding retaining power over entities that are more powerful and smarter than us. So that work, actually, I still believe that there's a lot that we need to do. Thanks, Prof, for fielding all those tough questions, and there were many. I'm going to look for your books. I have a keen interest actually in understanding AI, both technology and ethics, the ethics of it. I want to take this opportunity to also thank Mr. Prince Moyo, our SAIEE president, for hosting this prestigious lecture. I must give thanks to Professor Yandel and Wits University for the long-standing partnership of honoring the memory of Dr. Bernard Price through this lecture. Prof. Yandel, if you're still online, as the SAIEE, we value this partnership greatly. And lastly, let me thank our attendees for joining us today. Thanks for those probing questions that you've asked. Despite the load shedding, you stayed the course. Let me remind you that you'll find the handouts on the right-hand side of your screen. On there, you'll see that there's a 71st Bernard Price booklet. You'll also find the September issue of our What Now magazine. Please feel free to download and read at leisure. The third handout is the SAIEE Training Academy brochure. Currently, there's 7 courses on offer, online and face-to-face. Incidentally, we are running a special for companies who wish to upskill their staff online or at your offices, or we can even come to your facilities in a day that suits you, and we bring our lectures and material. What's more, you have the option to pay 2022 rates for training in 2023. There's group discounts, so please take advantage by sending an email to cpd@saiee.org.za. So that's cpd@saiee.org.za. With that, ladies and gentlemen, till the next event, I bid you farewell.
Good night, everyone. Good morning, Professor Russell.
Thanks. Thanks, Mings. Went well, very well, I think. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Good night, everyone.
Thanks all. Good night.